Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our panel on charting biodiversity pathways to sustainability in Canada. This panel has been organized as part of a SSHRC-funded research project on biodiversity pathways for sustainability in Canada, which is a project that's been led by Dr. Mi Lin as a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Concordia and at Future Earth. This project, while led by many people, has involved a year of review, research, and consultation with a broad range of stakeholders across the country on the successes, roadblocks, and opportunities that Canada has faced in its efforts to achieve the UN Aichi targets in 2020. This work has been done in the context of helping Canada to prepare for the next round of biodiversity targets, which will be announced later next year in Kunming. The results of this work have culminated in a report that we'll be happy to share with you at the end of this session. As we begin today, I would like to acknowledge that the participants of the panel are located in many different places across the country, many of us on unceded Indigenous lands. Gagnon-Gahaha Nation is recognized as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters around Montreal, where I'm speaking from, which has traditionally been known as a gathering place for many First Nations. It has been a very difficult year for Indigenous peoples in Canada, and we acknowledge the ongoing struggle for the rights of Indigenous people and the need for a truthful reckoning about the history of Canada and what is still happening today in order to keep working towards reconciliation. With this in mind, I'm very excited to share and present to you our 5 distinguished panelists and discussants. Each has been invited to share the unique perspectives on the challenges and opportunities for Canada to put itself on a path towards a more biodiverse and sustainable future. Our session today will be moderated by Dr. Kira Rudstup-Hearn. Kira is an environmental scientist based in Montreal and is currently director of the Canada Key Biodiversity Areas program with the Wildlife Conservation Society Canada. For our session today, we'll first hear from our 2 panelists and allow for a brief pause for you to ask questions to our panelists before inviting the next set of panelists and discussants to present their own unique perspectives. At that point, we will open it up to a full panel discussion. We'd ask and invite you to send your questions to the panelists for this part by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen uniquely. So we'll be checking that and curating questions to feed into the panel discussion. As well, throughout the program, they'll be launching 2 polls, one of which I believe is already available to you to learn about who is with us today in the room. And secondly, another one will be launched towards the end of the session to collect your reflections and feedback on what you've heard from our different panel discussions. So with this, I'd like to hand over to our moderator, Kira. Sure. Yeah, no problem. I'm very excited. We have 4 panelists today and 1 discussant. Our first panelist will be François Soulard, who is with us today. François, let me just go down to his biography. Oh, Kira's here? Fantastic. François Soulard is the research manager for the new Census of Environment program at Statistics Canada.
Excellent. Good afternoon, good evening, all. It's a pleasure to be here to say a few words about pathways to sustainability in Canada. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the fact that societies benefit from ecological functions and services much beyond what is generally recognized in our usual national metrics. Therefore, crucial links between ecology and society are never explored, and therefore they remain unestablished or misunderstood. What we need to do is to do better at recognizing this and garnering efforts towards the means of estimating or measuring these links. So one, I think, of the central set of ingredients that we need to do that is to do a better job at measuring from a national perspective our ecological infrastructure. And at Statistics Canada, we are pushing forward at establishing links with the different scientific communities in the country at both governmental and non-governmental to generate information on this ecological infrastructure, and looking at it from the perspective of their extent, the extent of the various ecosystems from which we depend and benefit, and looking at their condition and its evolution over time. Once we have that, we can actually start providing or measuring or estimating or getting a better idea of the services that are derived and the factors that supply these services. One of the advantages of us doing this at Statistics Canada is that we have a huge amount of data on the actual beneficiaries of these services and the conditions that determine the amount or how we actually are benefiting from these services, both those that are already embedded in economic measures, but maybe more importantly, those that are not, those that are outside of the economy. Once we have a good idea of the uses and the beneficiaries of these uses, we can start understanding the impact that we have through using the use of indicators and other types of analysis, the impact that we have in terms of managing these uses. And the outcome of that is understanding if we are actually having an impact that is negative or positive on the ecological infrastructure that generates the service in the first place. So providing a full picture of this ecosystem services logic chain is crucial for us to really better understand how we benefit from our environment and how this actually is critical to the sustainability of our societies. Next slide, please. But in order to do that, we have been working on doing this for a long time, and so have many others. But we were happy to see that in the last budget, the government heard our call and announced that they were going to fund what I called the Census of Environment in our proposal, which is a interdepartmental program based at Statistics Canada, by which we would be able to spend the time and effort required to produce metrics on what I just presented in the previous slide. And we will do that by creating a register of ecosystem assets, basically a continuously maintained central repository of baseline information on ecosystems and their services. And this will link to the other registries that exist within the National Statistical System that also include information from other departments and other aspects of civil society. And from this register, we can then create the profiles and the accounts that will allow us to actually provide estimates of these values, both in biophysical measures, but also ultimately in monetary measures. And how we do that is by the use of two internationally accepted statistical standards. They are used worldwide. One was established and accepted as a standard back in 2012. The other one was the one on ecosystems, was just recently adopted in March of 2021 as an international statistical standard. What that means is that all countries are invited to adopt this standard and to work towards providing information to complete it. We therefore have a framework that we'll be able to build on and actually help and receive help from other countries in terms of measuring and filling the gaps that I've identified before. Next slide, please. And the reason why Statistics Canada does this and why other national statistics offices around the world also will do this is because we're in a good position in order to provide this information. It was recognized in this editorial in Nature last year that National Statistics Office are in the right position to do this. We are the honest brokers of governmental information. We're able to work on different fronts, and we already do this kind of reporting traditionally in economic and social statistics, but increasingly so in environmental information. So by us embedding ourselves in the science with the science departments and civil society and producing this information, I think this will allow us to us as Canadians have a better idea of the sustainability pathways that we're on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, François. So what you are hearing today from our speakers are very short pitches about what they think could be transformative in biodiversity conservation in Canada from their own perspectives. So we'll be hearing very short pitches, but we'll have a much longer time at the end in our panel discussion to get into these ideas in further detail. So we'll go immediately to our next speaker. Danica Billy Littlechild is an assistant professor at Carleton University in the Department of Law and Legal Studies. We are very happy to have her here with us today. She's from Ermineskin Cree Nation in Treaty 6 territory in Alberta. She's been an advisor and leader on innumerable processes serving First Nations from global to national to local on issues related to environment, health, governance, water, climate change, sustainability, and biodiversity conservation. Welcome, Danica.
Hi, Donsa Kakio, Kananaskum Dinawa, Uta Pintumiak. Thank you so much for inviting me to share some thoughts and ideas today at this conference. I'm very grateful to those who enabled my presence here, and my thanks to the organizers as well. I am going to be speaking today, and you can go to the next slide. I'm going to be speaking today about Indigenous peoples in the context of biodiversity and conservation. And I am going to speak specifically to the experience that we have had in Canada. The history of protected areas and biodiversity conservation in Canada, while somewhat improved in recent times, has been fraught with rights violations, forced loss of access to traditional territories and resources, and other substantial intergenerational, cultural, social, economic, and spiritual impacts. And so in the work that I have done with the Indigenous Circle of Experts, which was a body convened in the context of Canada in order to assist Canada in meeting the Aichi targets some years ago, we actually try to address some of these dark histories and to understand them in the context of emerging and existing standards, such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And here in Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, which called for reconciliation through the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. One of the most insidious impacts of historic protected areas and practices and protocols around biodiversity conservation is the disconnection that they have fostered between Indigenous peoples and their territories. And this disconnection disrupted far more than just individual experiences. It prevented the full functionality of Indigenous legal orders and Indigenous knowledge systems tied to spaces and places captured by protection and conservation, and weakened the necessary linkages for intergenerational knowledge transmission and sustainable use, and may have even led to the loss of stories, songs, ceremonies, dances, and other practices that were geographically and intrinsically tied to specific sites that were captured within the context of biodiversity conservation and protected areas. And so when we did the work as the Indigenous Circle of Experts and in the contribution that I have tried to make to this project, it's our understanding that some of the goals like ecological integrity and purely scientific approaches, science-based rationales for protection and conservation have not really made appropriate space for Indigenous knowledge systems, which have neither been adequately nor equitably engaged for these purposes. And this, if this engagement were to take place in an appropriate way, this would, I would say, lead to transformative outcomes. We know that there have been significant efforts for meaningful inclusion of Indigenous peoples in protected areas and biodiversity conservation. But we also know that many existing standards, such as the UN Declaration and the Pillar Right of free, prior, and informed consent, has not necessarily been implemented as a set of minimum standards that are to be met not only by the UN system, but by the states who have endorsed that declaration as well. And so here in Canada, we want to elevate Indigenous systems which value lands and waters and all the beings and spirits that are intrinsically connected to those places and spaces, which will then, we feel, empower and elevate those Indigenous systems to a place of equality and equity in the context of decision making and biodiversity conservation. And for us as Indigenous peoples, culture and language is at the heart of it all. When I was growing up in my home community, which is a small reserve in Treaty 6 territory in Alberta, I used to be able to go into the bush behind my family home and walk over to my Gugum's house with my grandmother's house with my late uncle and see a lot of biodiversity and receive lessons about those plants and medicines that we would gather. But now when I try to take my son to the same place, we are seeing desertification and crabgrass in its place. But I refuse to give up on that small place in the planet, and I don't want my son to give up on it either. If you go to the next page, next slide. As a result, I really feel that my focus and the focus of many Indigenous peoples working in the field of biodiversity conservation is to emphasize the importance of Indigenous-led conservation, where Indigenous peoples have a primary role in determining the objectives, the boundaries, the management, and governance structures as an aspect of the exercise of self-determination, and to ensure a transmission of culture, language, law, knowledge, etc. Making appropriate space for Indigenous peoples requires us to understand how our systems in all the complex ways that they interact with one another, science, Indigenous peoples, other types of institutions, private actors. We need to sort of come to an understanding of the importance of Indigenous peoples and the role that they ought to play in the context of biodiversity conservation. And as such, we have to emphasize the vital importance of Indigenous rights, and as we as Indigenous peoples often say, our responsibilities, because for us, in the context of our legal orders, rights do not come without responsibilities. And our ability to exercise stewardship tied to those responsibilities is fundamental for the continuity and the sustainability of our nations, our peoples, our families, our kinship, and our relationality to all aspects of Mother Earth. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Danica. We have a few minutes for some questions specific to the two presentations that you just heard. For anyone participating in this session in the audience, I'd like to ask you to put any questions that you have into the Q&A section of this platform. Danica, I'll start with a question to you. So what you were describing does indeed sound transformative, and it sounds like there is a lot of interest in trying to actually do what you're saying, but I don't think that we're anywhere close to achieving what you're describing in order to make it transformative. I'm wondering who would be involved in the very deep engagement that you're describing? You mentioned a few different actors. Are there certain actors with bigger roles to play here, like government, educators, NGOs? How do we get everyone involved?
I think we have to use the tools and the mechanisms that we have available to us, as well as understand the need to co-create new mechanisms of relationality when it comes to Indigenous peoples in the field of biodiversity conservation. So specifically, I'm thinking about using existing mechanisms like the Convention on Biological Diversity, Article HA working group, which are sort of obvious places. But I'm thinking also of the less obvious places. For example, the annual Forum on Business and Human Rights, which I believe the Indigenous Caucus will begin tomorrow, where Indigenous peoples will come from all around the world to talk about the impact of corporate activity on their traditional territories. We can also look at the existing infrastructure that we have built, within the international fora, but also nationally within Canada and within provinces and territories to try to understand how to approach protections and issues around biodiversity. And understanding that all of these different structures, mechanisms, and infrastructures do have sort of some bias that we're going to have to confront when it comes to the inclusion of Indigenous peoples. I think for me, though, the really fundamental thing that has to happen is for people to begin to see Indigenous peoples as experts of themselves and of their territories, and to treat them as such in the context of these different structures and mechanisms. And this can actually be quite challenging because we're very accustomed, I think, within the dominant systems to sort of taking a reductionist approach to Indigenous knowledge, to talking about TEK, for example, traditional ecological knowledge, as sort of the only entry point for Indigenous contribution to decision-making pertaining to biodiversity conservation. And I would argue that we have to begin to see Indigenous peoples and their systems as a whole, as opposed to small parts or pieces that are easily digestible by the dominant mechanisms. And part of that is actually, we are seeing movement on it. We are seeing commitments from our federal government here in Canada to elevate Indigenous systems through the establishment of Indigenous protected and conserved areas. Can take a lot of different types of forms and don't have one sort of template form, and can protect all kinds of different ways and means of understanding and protecting biodiversity. We can also see that internationally, the push towards nature-based solutions dovetails quite nicely with a lot of Indigenous approaches to some of these issues. If we can find convergences and cross-validations between these systems, I feel confident that in an era when we are beginning to see the true respect and elevation of Indigenous peoples, I feel like we have sort of a critical momentum that we can build on, and I feel very optimistic.
Thank you so much, Danica, for that response. I deeply appreciate what you've just said there. There's one question for Francois as well, and we will get back. We will have the opportunity to go deeper into that too when we get to the panel discussion. We have tons of time, so this is very exciting. We're just getting started. The question for Francois is, does StatCan have a way of assessing non-economic values that cannot be translated easily into monetary terms?
That is quite a challenge. There are ways to do that kind of provide those measures. They are still also being developed. There are methods that are accepted, other methods that are debatable and debated. So there's no one answer to that question, but the idea is to at least first and foremost produce the information using biophysical metrics that are required to do the monetization of these services, and where appropriate, put values on these assets and these services, recognizing that it is not only difficult, but it also contentious. And this should not be seen as a way to monetize our environment, but it's actually giving a voice to our environment, where usually the analysis, when it comes time to do any kind of development, uses the monetary metrics. So if that measure does not exist for the environment, it actually receives a value of 0. So in order for these issues to be, the environment and our ecological systems to be recognized, we need to proceed. But it remains that this will require a lot of work and a lot of coordination and a lot of discussion and a lot of participation for us to move forward.
Super. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to our next two presenters, but Francois, I'm going to come back to you in the panel with a challenge, which will be to, after having heard what Danica had to say and presenting your own sort of transformative mechanism, my question in the panel to you will be, how do you think that that census of the environment will be able to support the kinds of engagement with Indigenous communities that Danica was describing? I'll leave you to think about that for a little while, and I'll introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Andy Gonzalez, who is a professor in the Department of Biology at McGill University. He's a co-chair of GeoBon. He's the Lieber Arrow Chair in Conservation Biology and a founding director of the Quebec Center for Biodiversity Science. So welcome, Andy.
Thank you, Kira, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Next slide, please. So today I'd like to draw your attention to what I think is the critical societal issue facing Canada today. That is the changing state of our natural environment, which, as we know, is many things to many people. And it determines the state of our economy, our livelihoods, our health, the access we have to recreation. That physical and natural environment embodies Canada's well-being. And what we are aware of right now is that Canada is facing rapid climate change, as you see on the very top map there on the top left. That red and yellow hues indicate the degree to which Canada's climate is above the global average. And as some of you may know, Canada's climate is changing at twice the global average. And below that, you see the human footprint. That is the change that we, our economies, our cities, our actions on the environment, our use of natural resources have on the physical structure of our landscapes and our seascapes and our fresh waters. And those two factors of change are combining to induce runaway biodiversity change, which you're seeing on the right. What you're seeing on the right is a map of the distribution of our species at risk of extinction. This is just one measure of the rapid change in our biological diversity. We know that many of our ecosystems are currently in a degrading state. And as we know, that many of our natural resources are going to change as the climate change and as our footprint is increased. So the most pressing societal issue, I think, is that we need to better understand how to manage our natural resources, how to attain a more balanced stewardship of our natural resources and our natural biodiversity. Next slide. So to do that, we need information, we need knowledge, we need data that can be shared across different sectors of society, across different sectors of civil society, the private and public sectors, because in order to manage our natural environment, we're going to need massive collaboration at a scale that we've not seen. This is a pressing policy issue. If we're going to meet our commitments to the global biodiversity framework, the new global biodiversity framework of the Convention on Biological Diversity, we need to be aware of a conclusion that was made way back in 2010, that we currently lack the long-term standardized, spatially complete and readily accessible monitoring information that we need. And this is significantly hindering our capacity to assess the status and health of Canada's ecosystems. This is a report that was published by a joint collaboration between federal, provincial, and territorial governments in 2010. And sadly, the situation has not changed. We lack the information to manage our natural environment. We've been monitoring our geological environment for more than 150 years. We regularly survey our geological environment in Canada, those biophysical resources, but we've never surveyed our biodiversity. So what I would like to do is propose a way to reorganize ourselves across the different elements of our society to measure the changing state of our biodiversity and to set us on a more sustainable pathway. As a matter of interest, what you see on the left here is a map that shows all the records of biodiversity from the Global Biodiversity Information System, shown in yellow and orange there. And you see that they're all closely packed along the southern border of Canada. In fact, 90% of our information is within 2 kilometers of our roads. So we have a very poor picture of our biodiversity. Next slide. So the way to change this is to produce a massive societal, collaborative, collected effort to form what I call a Canada Biodiversity Observation Network, or Canada BON for short. This is the idea is in line with a global effort called GeoBon to stitch together national efforts to keep track of our biodiversity. And what I'm proposing is a partnership effort that will connect academia, monitoring organizations, indigenous people, civil society into a big effort that you see shown in this cycle here, where we take traditional knowledge, research-based knowledge, information coming from civil society, from our museums, for example, from iNaturalist and the types of efforts that citizens are using to observe nature, and to produce this cycle that supports decisions and policies that is designed to detect trends, identify early warnings and potential tipping points in the status of our environment. So it's this collective effort that I would like to see happen. And earlier this summer this year, we brought together more than 60 participants with Indigenous leadership, representatives from Canadian government and from the research community and NGOs to work towards this. So I'm going to leave you with this idea, to tease you with this idea that we are on the cusp of pulling together the people we need and the organizations we need to invest in this bold new project for Canada for the 21st century that will allow us to set us on a pathway for a more sustainable society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. I'd like to welcome now Dr. Katia Neves, who's a professor of sociology and anthropology at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada.
All right, thank you. I want to thank the panelists for the invitation to be here today and compliment you on the array of knowledge practices that you brought together. I think it's representative of the kind of challenge that Andy just talked about in terms of this massive collective engagement that needs to take place. I would like to address a parallel issue, which is the shift that occurred in our societies in the last 500 years that basically led to fallacies in how we think about our relationship with nature and that are at the root of the environmental problems that we live with today. And because of that, we have lost a perspective that focused on the holistic nature of natural phenomena and human environmental relations, and instead dissected reality into little bits and pieces that each group tries to look at and deal with, but which is insufficient. So for more than 150 years now, social scientists have been working towards understanding how it is that entire societies have come to perceive themselves as separate from nature. Not only that, but also how this schism became so dominant as a way of relating to the world. The answers that social scientists have been able to provide reveal a vast and complex set of dynamics that lie at the root of our current environmental woes. So the slide that you're looking at illustrates what some of these are, and I'll walk us through it. I'll briefly outline two major historical transformations pertaining to this state of affairs. These are the emergence of modernity in Europe between the 16th and 19th centuries and its subsequent dissemination on a global scale, and B, the rise of capitalism and its expansion also across the globe. Know that there are many other transformations, but these two are quite central to the onset of the environmental crisis that we currently face, and they're a good place for us to start this conversation. The emergence of modernity is associated with the conceptual separation of humans from nature, as you can see in the slide, which in turn operated as the ideological underpinning for the exploitation of ecosystems and peoples around the world. Modern thinking turned the historical reality of human, non-human embroilment or human nature connectivity into the imaginary categories of society and nature. These are now so ubiquitous that a lot of people have a hard time even thinking about the fact that these are artificial categories in our society and that they're not representative of our societies historically, nor are they representative of many other worldviews and knowledge practices that exist, including indigenous worldviews and practices. Within the context of modernity, The realm of humans became associated with culture seen as separate from nature, and it was deemed to possess subjectivity, agency, rights, and morality. Nature, in the context of modernity, came to be seen as an object void of subjecthood, rights, and imbued with no moral standing. Whereas in pre-modern times, human relationships with non-humans were couched in terms of reciprocity and notions of stewardship, with the sedimentation of modernity, nature was reduced to an array of resources to be used for the benefit of human progress. Moreover, modernity instituted an ideational framework of hierarchies, whereby, for example, society came to be perceived as superior to nature, and European societies came to be perceived as superior to non-European societies. This worldview was used to justify modern European colonizing endeavors on a global scale, and eventually also to legitimize the extractive, destructive relations that exist between capitalism and our planet's biota. At the most basic level, capitalism entails a series of practices whereby value is extracted from non-humans, i.e. natural resources. And this is the opposite of the kinds of reciprocity that characterized pre-modern knowledge practices in Europe, and which still characterizes the knowledge practices of many peoples around the world, notably indigenous peoples as an example. So we can move on to the next slide. One of the biggest challenges we face today is to dismantle these modern tenets, and in so doing to envision new socioeconomic and environmental futures that not only reconceptualize but also respect the inextricability of the relationships that make life on our planet possible. There are many examples of successful work that seeks to restore reciprocal and ultimately sustainable relations between humans and non-humans. I've been conducting research and publishing on this for the past 25 years, and there really is reason for optimism. Still, much needs to be done to encompass the much larger segments of society, including the average citizen. Citizens can play major roles as consumers, and we can switch slides, as well as in their participation in electorate democracy. A first step will be to dismantle the false belief that humans are separate from nature, that humans have the right to exploit nature, and here's quotations on the word nature, and that humans have the power to control nature. So there are many suggestions we could present to as a way forward, more ethical consumption, where people trace the goods that they're purchasing in terms of how they were produced. Also checking the political platforms of elected officials and voting according to the information that's provided there. But a very basic first step is to have people engage in ways that will help them embody the awareness of the connectedness that exists between humans and non-humans. Forest therapy is an example of this. People are increasingly aware that humans and nature are inextricably interconnected, but the average person sometimes has difficulties in finding ways to actually embody that knowledge. So this is an example of a practice that constitutes a first step in that direction.
Thank you very much, Katia. We have time again to answer questions that are specifically about these last two presentations. So please put your questions in the Q&A area of this platform. If you haven't found where that is, it's at the bottom in that list of icons. I'll take a minute now, though, to just quickly look at the results of our first poll while you're putting your questions in there. And so this poll is really just to show who's present today at this session. And we're very interested in the perspectives of people from all places, from all sectors, to get an idea of the roles of different people and how they can contribute towards transformative biodiversity pathways in Canada. So we're seeing that there's quite a few conservation practitioners here. That's about 20% of the people present here. There are a number of urban residents, so that's actually even higher. And there's the highest numbers from the public sector, which I suppose is not so surprising. We have a number of researchers, fewer than in the other categories, and I can't quite see the bottom of the poll, but there may be some other people present as well. So we have time for questions. I don't know. Let me just quickly check the Q&A. Excellent. So a first question would be for Dr. Gonzalez. So Andy, we clearly have lots of information out there already, and a lot of people would argue that really what we're missing is the will to act. What do you think would be most compelling about putting all the information together that you've described to encourage action, immediate action on the part of different actors in society?
Thanks, Kira. So the first element, my answer has two elements to it. The first is that we do have a lot of information, but all of that information is in the same place geographically and is not necessarily in the places where it needs to be to actually inform change. Now, by inform, we can be informing our decisions in many ways, and I'm not espousing any one particular source of information, but biodiversity science at the moment recognizes different types of information are needed in order to guide our way of managing biological diversity, whether that is genetic resources, whether that is the status of our populations or our ecosystems, and on up to entire integrated landscapes and seascapes. I can assure you we do not have the data at hand to manage all of those facets in their entirety. We can manage in ways that we've done historically, but what concerns me most is the need to bring together information, to collect new information in places where change is happening most rapidly, especially in the north, and putting ourselves in a state of readiness for a future that we are not ready for. I'm talking about a climate future, I'm talking about an environmental future, and a civil society that's currently being exposed to forms of environmental change that we've not experienced. So I think it would be myopic to go forward thinking we know enough, we have already, if that was true, then we'd be in an equilibrium condition, the world would not be changing, but we are in just the opposite. So that is not to say that I am advocating a sit and wait perspective here. Oh, we'll only act when we're ready. No, I think what I'm proposing is an adaptive approach to the management of our society's relationship to the environment, recognizing, just as Katya pointed to, our role and our presence in that enormous biophysical reality, that recognize our impact on it. And so to do that, I think requires a game-changing shift on how we acknowledge and respect the ways we understand our relationship to nature, using better principles of data sharing and how to use that information to inform decisions. So I'll leave it there. I hope I've painted a picture that it's not business as usual and that what we have at hand is not sufficient.
Super, thank you for that answer. There are a few other questions for you as well, but I want to ask one question to Katya. And my question is, who do you think, so you've described sort of how things are changing a little bit. Who do you think should be the leaders to bring our society towards the value changes that are required to really have a transformative impact on how we interact with the environment?
Mm-hmm. I think that it has to be all across the board. There's certainly a role for institutions like schools and universities and so on to play. And they have been playing an important role in that context. But there's also a role that is there for us to listen to maybe societies that have a greater wisdom when it comes to understanding our relationship with non-humans and emphasizing the reciprocity and the holism that actually characterizes that. And also, there's definitely a role to be played by, policy and governance in pushing back against this idea of dissecting reality into different categories that then are each tackled on their own, and focus more on the relationship between the various aspects of what we're talking about. So the biodiversity challenges, how they relate to, the economics of our society, how does that relate to policy, etc.
Super, thanks very much. And there are some more questions for you as well, but we're going to save the couple of extra questions for the longer discussion period. And we are going to move, which we're now moving into, but we will first ask our colleague Kyle Artel to provide some thoughts on the presentations that we've heard to date. So Kyle Artel is Dr. Artel is an adjunct assistant professor in the geography department at the University of Victoria. He's a Banting postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Earth, Environmental and Geographic Sciences at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan campus. And he's a Raincoast Conservation Foundation biologist. So Kyle and his colleagues work on conservation in support of both people and places and investigate natural resource management very broadly, including the potential for supporting resurgent Indigenous-led governance for just and effective conservation approaches. So he has some perspectives on all of the presentations that we've heard to date, and that will get us hopefully thinking, including everyone in the audience, about how all of these pieces could fit together. And then we will have an open discussion about that. And we do look forward to your questions, so please keep adding those to the Q&A and we won't miss any of them, I promise.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, my role here was to summarize some of the key takeaways from each presentation, which is no small task. Those are fantastic. And then to provide a little bit of a reflection on those and how sort of the broader question of pathways to biodiversity protection in Canada. I just want to provide a little bit of context for the positionality of where I'm coming from. So I'm lucky enough to be based in the Heikkauk village of Bella Bella, or Weglisla, in the area now commonly referred to as the Great Bear Rainforest. I'm not Heikkauk myself. I'm a Kumsiwa. I'm of European origin, but I'm lucky enough to be doing work here for and with the Heikkauk and neighboring nations. And so this is sort of just some of the context of where my reflections, the positionality I'm coming from. So some of the key points that I heard from the panelists, and please do correct me afterwards if I misrepresent these, but what I was hearing, Dr. Soulard was sharing the need to assess how sort of ecological infrastructure that provides ecosystem services change over time across the country, and the strong potential of statistics agencies, and in particular the Census of the Environment, the strong potential of these for doing exactly that. Dr. Littlechild described sort of the foundational importance of upholding Indigenous rights, responsibilities, sovereignty in any of our thinking about conservation. And so recognizing Indigenous peoples themselves are the sort of appropriate decision makers for stewardship of their own nations, of their peoples, relations, territories, etc. And how sort of truly breathing life into that concept in a meaningful way could lead to truly transformational changes in biodiversity outcomes. Dr. Gonzalez shared that environmental change is one of the key issues of our time here. And again, I'm calling in here from British Columbia, so I agree with that notion. And addressing these environmental changes is a key societal challenge. And he identified the Biodiversity Observation Network as a means of pulling together knowledge from a bunch of knowledge sources to help inform decision-making to that end. Dr. Neves described the importance of worldview and our understanding of our role as people, our place in nature, and how that understanding ultimately shapes our interactions with the environment. And described that much needs to be done to change our role in the environment, and provided some nice tangible advice, such as using things like forest therapy to really make concrete our true interactions with nature, our connection to it. So some incredible insights offered here, some nice tangible steps for moving biodiversity conservation forward. And the quick reflection that I wanted to offer, I'll offer almost as a question for everyone here. And that is how scale of governance ties into this idea of transforming biodiversity conservation in Canada. So again, from what we've just heard, there's a lot of discussion of a need and a foundational change in how we perceive the environment, how we interact with it, as that relates to worldview, for example, to recognize and to sort of solidify our close interactions with the environment. And, you know, this idea isn't this pie in the sky, far-fetched idea. As Dr. Littlechild discussed, how Indigenous governance systems across the country, they provide some concrete examples of this. Where I'm sitting today physically provides an example of that. And across examples of Indigenous-led systems of of areas governed by local peoples, the well-being of species and places tends to generally exceed the outcomes of state-led Western or colonial approaches, even of conserved areas of state-led conserved areas. And so this has been shown empirically across Canada and the world that you generally get better biodiversity outcomes in these areas stewarded by local peoples. And so a key ingredient of that is that these Indigenous and local driven governance systems are fundamentally place-based, and they're driven by worldviews, laws, and people closely tied to place, and that have been tied to place often for millennia. So they're driven from place, not from Victoria, not from Ottawa. And so my question to the group is, if place-based approaches are so key, if having this sort of being very tied to place conceptually, physically, and otherwise, if supporting Indigenous sovereignty, rights, title, and responsibility is so key, then is Canada the right scale to be thinking about conservation at? And importantly, for conservation decisions to be made at? Does it make sense ecologically, for example, given how many different ecological contexts there are across the landscape of what we now call Canada? Does it make sense from a people perspective in terms of how many people's territories are encompassed in what we now call Canada? Does it make sense for prioritizing areas for conservation, where if you're using national metrics, you might identify areas that seem optimally important for Canada, but that might result in sort of leaving whole territories off the map, whole communities, and having them outside of the conversation of biodiversity protection. So if the answer is no to that, if that isn't the right scale for driving conservation decision-making, how do we take the machinery of Canada, so the institutions, the governments, the infrastructure, sort of the capacity that we have, that are currently at the federal or provincial or territorial scale, how do we take that machinery and use it to support place-based governance, place-based decision-making at the scale that's maybe more appropriate, and do so in a way that truly supports people and places and recognizes and meaningfully supports the rights, title, responsibilities, and sovereignty of people whose territories we're ultimately talking about. So in other words, how do we take the sort of large-scale machinery we have now, where we often think of Canada leading decision-making for conservation, switching that around to place-based, but having the Canadian machinery support that place-based decision-making and governance. And I'll say that there are some really wonderful examples of this. Dr. Littlechild already mentioned the work, for example, of the Indigenous Circle of Experts, that I think in a lot of ways is doing just that. But I just wanted to leave that as an open-ended question of how do we reconcile this sort of place-based connection to environment approaches that have stood the test of time with the Canada-wide processes, institutions, and other machinery currently in place. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kyle. Those were some very interesting thoughts. Given the people are here, some might find them provocative. I think that they're very interesting, and I hope we can discuss them at length now. We did have a second poll that was launched, and the poll was asking which community, no, this is the first poll that's on the slide. Is there a second poll? So the results, the first poll, the results we've already shared, although I sadly left out the administrators, which also are an important group of people present at the presentation today. The second poll is asked which of the following suggestions proposed by each speaker as a way forward, and we're talking about a way forward towards transformative biodiversity change, can you contribute to? And given the people that we've already described as being in the room today, the results may be indicative of where they feel that they actually have some acting power, or maybe not. So I'd say there was a tie for listening to Indigenous voices and facilitating the development of a Canadian biodiversity observation network. Those were the two items that people felt most able to contribute to, but then also engaging in ways that could help you embody awareness of the connectedness of humans and non-humans. Interesting that not everybody was could imagine contributing to that. And then supporting the census of the environment, which is also an interesting result, because it is something the census does touch us all, but maybe not everyone feels that they could contribute to that. So that's something that Francois might be able to address in terms of what are the roles of different sectors of society in contributing to that census. So thanks for those inputs to everyone that has contributed an answer. And I'd like to invite everyone now to join me on the main stage for a panel discussion. And we've had a number of really interesting questions. And first, I think I would like everyone to have the opportunity to address the question that Kyle posed before, because I think it's quite an interesting question. And I'm going to ask you all to provide just a few minutes of thought, so not too long, because there are some other questions to get to. And I'll start with Danica.
Hi, Kyle. Thank you so much for that wonderful reflection on the presentations. And what you said very much resonated with me. And of course, these are questions that I think as a society, we have to confront in the context of understanding relationality between peoples, and also in the context of understanding our relationality to Mother Earth, as we would call her, as Indigenous peoples, as Cree peoples, which is where I am from. For myself, I think the short and pithy answer is that we need to reconsider our legal and ethical frameworks as well. Because sometimes just because something is legal does not mean it is moral. And I think we are in a moment as humankind where we are revisiting our relationships, our understanding of our connection to the natural world. And I think this is happening at a large scale, in particular in the face of, climate change and extreme biodiversity loss. We are seeing sort of a citizenry, a civil society that is becoming much more alive to these issues and much more engaged and willing to hear different ideas for solutions and paths forward. And so, from my perspective, this is a wonderful momentum to build upon at right now that we all sort of collectively have, and I think we should take it. And I think part of that is will be in our ability to truly make space for the elevation of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And this is challenging because we are accustomed to a specific style of governance and legal structure. And it does require us to revisit those things. And as many Indigenous peoples posit, to think very critically about what decolonization means in the context of conservation and biodiversity protection. Facing those very serious questions together and doing it in a collaborative and ethical way can put us on a good path moving forward.
Thank you, Danica. Francois, I'll give the next opportunity to you. And it does tie into the challenge that I posed to you at the end of your session too, which is, if as Kyle was saying, there are questions about what scale governance needs to happen and decisions need to happen, and where should governance occur in Canada. And the Census of the Environment clearly is, a national initiative. And then I also asked, well, how would this support Indigenous-led conservation and the kinds of approaches that Danica has been talking about?
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Kyle, for those reflections. It is a very good question, and you talk about the mechanics or the machinery of Canada, and of course, being a representative of the National Statistics Office, I'm really embedded in that national mechanic. However, StatCan is not a federal agency. It's a national agency. Therefore, we have the obligation, and the intent is for us to provide information not to provinces only, but to all in Canada. In the course of history and the development of national statistics, a lot of it has been based on the needs of the economy and society, but very much centralized in large aggregates. The turn now is that this new international standards for ecosystem accounting is centered around the place. It is by definition, it needs to be by definition, it's spatially explicit. The idea is to go down as in the finest resolution as possible to provide these estimates. And it makes a lot of sense to provide an estimate of the renewable water flows at the national level over the year. Makes very little. It may make some sense, but it's not really useful. We need to have information that is local and in time, which is on a smaller time step. So the work of the Census of Environment is to do just that. Try to provide local information as much as possible in a smaller time step that is actually more in tune with the needs of ecologists to do what their own work. Now, how this ties into traditional knowledge, indigenous traditional knowledge, is that a lot of that knowledge is crucial to understand what is happening in the environment. It has been disregarded for way too long. It is central for us to understand what's going on. I think we can agree on that. But as a result, there is a lot of demand on that information. There's a lot of demand on that knowledge, and it's unreasonable, maybe unethical, to expect us to be served because now we want it, now we need it. It would be disrespectful to do that, to put additional burden on individuals that are already stressed by demands. They are knowledgeable experts, and we need to understand, but we can't just go on and beg for that information. So there's two parts to how we can address that. The first part is through the governance of the Census of Environment, which, by the way, in the first iteration, when I thought of it, I was seeing it as a census of Mother Earth, and it was represented like that in our own management for a while. First aspect is on the governance. Find ways to minimize the burden on Indigenous leaders and experts, but find a way to make that information come in the national statistical system. And there are processes right now in place to do that. And we're going to piggyback on these processes, not develop our own and start in parallel. But secondly, what I would really hope to do is not come and ask for that knowledge, but instead offer to share the knowledge we have. So when we build this information on ecosystems and the condition of these ecosystems and their capacity to generate the services and so forth, we will be offering to those who are interested to provide special tabulation or compilation of data that may be useful for them, and provide them data and analysis to the best of our capacity. I think this will be, if I look at it from my perspective, also it will be beneficial in the long term to establish this relationship. But it's not something we want to. It's not a relationship that we see as a one-way relationship, and we'll start by giving, not asking.
Thank you, Francois. Andy, I'll come back to you in a second, and I'm going to go to Katja first because she actually is leaving a little bit early today. So Katja, I'd like to ask you to respond also to Kyle's interventions, and I also have an additional question for you too, which is coming from the audience, and which is, how can we make the general public truly engage in all of these kinds of initiatives in doing their part apart from detached individual actions? So if you have time to maybe just touch on that one as well, along with your own reflections.
Yeah, I'll be very happy to do that. And I want to thank the public for that excellent question. And also, Kyle, I'm going to try to contain myself because the question you asked is extremely pertinent, and there's a lot to be said about that. I'm going to start with the notion of scale, and I'd like to make a distinction between two ways in which we need to think about scale. We need to think about the scale of environmental phenomena, and that operates at different scales, right? So I'm going to use examples for the benefit of the public, those amongst the public who maybe are not scientists who think about these things all the time. Whales are a migratory species, and if you look at the debates that took place around how to regulate whale watching in the Azores in the middle of the Atlantic, the temporal and spatial scale that people were dealing with there was, first of all, very localized, and then in terms of time, very compressed, because it's what people knew in that particular context. And the impact of whale watching from that point of view seemed to be minimal. But if you step back a little bit and think about the migratory nature of how whales move, then you start to see that in the long term, so we step back in terms of space and in terms of time, in the long term, the impact is actually much greater than one might think, because the whale watching activities disrupt feeding, et cetera, et cetera. But you also start to see that in places where whale watching is done super intrusively, whales actually stop migrating through those spaces. So, you have all these different scales operating at different points in time and in different spatial dynamics. The reason why I brought this up is to say that there's a mismatch between our modern ways of governing and the nature of ecological phenomena. So our modern ways of governing society stem from the Westphalian Treaty of 1648, which established the roots of the sovereign nation state. It's an artificial construction, and it's one that's done out of political effort. It doesn't come from a naturally existing unity, cultural unity. It comes from political effort to create that unity. So what we end up having is phenomena that some of them is global in nature, and then you have sovereign nations that can't speak to one another and agree on anything, like the COP26 indicated. And you have ecological phenomena that cut across the different nation states. So it's not all bad news. And I'd like to refer back to what Danica was saying in terms of the need to decolonize these systems and to engage in genuine collaborative ethical relationships. They actually already are in place. And I'm not saying that there isn't a role for the nation state. There definitely is a role there in terms of legislating, etc. But what has happened in the last few decades is the emergence of networks of governance that occur parallel to the nation state. And these are networks where a variety of constituents, private citizens, but even governments, municipalities, scientists, etc., come together to deal with environmental problems that spread across and beyond these nation-state boundaries. So an example of a successful instance of this was the monarch butterfly. There's a network that cuts across Canada, US, and Mexico that involves regular citizens who are collecting data that they provide to the scientists, municipalities that are helping to create habitat, etc., governments, etc. And so you end up having this vast, super vast network of all sorts of different groups and interests involved in protecting the monarch. Now, the issue is not so much that the monarch is ecologically that fundamental, but it operates as an umbrella species under which entire ecosystems get to be protected. So there are examples of networks that are all operating that already overcome the kinds of limitations that you were talking about, but also operate at these different scales. And I don't want to speak for the knowledge that Danica brings to the table, but I know that there are incredibly effective networks of Indigenous people operating on a global scale, also providing excellent examples of how the limitations of our modern systems of governance can be overcome. So going to the question from the general public, this already starts to give you a sense of the many ways in which people are involved. So, for example, citizen science is something that's becoming increasingly important. And whereas citizen scientists used to be merely entry points for data, they're becoming more and more involved in the science itself, including defining what are the questions that asked by science, what are the ethically important matters that ought to be looked into, and how. Citizens also can play a very important role as consumers. There is such a thing as ethical consumption, in the sense that people can trace where their goods are coming from. People can put a check on how much they're consuming and the environmental impact that this all can have. Citizens have a lot more power than they often realize in terms of electing people to become their representatives in governance, but also in terms of voicing ethical positions and taking a stance on them. And again, collaborating with other groups that share similar interests and visions. I'm sorry, I'm trying to keep it short so that there's time for everybody else.
That was a fantastic answer, Katja. Thank you very much. So we'll move to Andy just to give you time to talk about some of Kyle's reflections. And I'm going to add a little question from the audience onto yours as well, which is one of the audience members noted that the lack of progress on biodiversity conservation over the last 10 years is very disturbing. And what are the main reasons for that? So that's your part two.
Those are two big questions. First, thank you to Kyle for those reflections and for doing such a good job summarizing, which is, I know, is a challenging thing to do. First, I fully agree that conservation is fundamentally a place-based activity. We have to, that when we consider a unit the size of Canada without recognizing the enormous richness of its biological history, of the continuity of that, of the historicity of those ecosystems, of those life forms that are on our landscapes and seascapes. The risk is that we decompose the problem as we do in a reductionist viewpoint and think, okay, it's just going to be one tree at a time. And I allude to Canada's strength and climate plan, where the plan is to, spend $4 billion and plant 2 billion trees. That's easily said, right? But where do you plant those trees? How do you plant those trees? How do you respect the life of those trees and the life of of the organisms and the people that are going to receive those trees? And so what we have learned from that is that you cannot think of trees as sticks of carbon, that they are entering into an ecosystem with a certain history about it. And we're realizing that choosing the place requires a community of people. It requires a reflection on the ecological knowledge that we have about that place, and then asking ourselves, are these the appropriate places to plant the trees? And we're realizing that it's actually much more about restoring ecosystems, about restoring the places where people are living. We have deforested, we have removed millions of trees from our landscapes, and there's value in restoring forests and trees where that is appropriate. But so to do genuine place-based conservation is a joint recognition of the history of the people and the history of the living systems, of the ecosystems. There is no natural unit for that. The closest thing we have is what is called an ecoregion, which is sort of a very natural aggregate of species and assemblages, soils and topographies that have been shown to have very powerful conservation value as a unit, as I'm sure you know. But as I try to explain to the others on this call, or on this meeting, it's a way of thinking about units that we can cohere action around. And so, of course, then you're in a hierarchy of efforts down to places. And we're seeing an enormous, to speak to Katja's point about the role of networks, the way organizations, municipalities, NGOs, civil society are coming together to inform this action in places, but in places in a way that's much more cognizant of the connectivity among them. So I've been deeply involved in that in several ways. One, by forming a science network whose mission is to connect with these other networks and these other players and stakeholders and rights holders. And we're seeing now, I think, for the first time, an engagement, sort of out of the ivory tower into society, and an engagement of research into action in sort of this sort of co-design, co-developed way. So I'm positive, pretty optimistic about moving away from 2 billion sticks of carbon to thinking about Canada's landscapes and conservation in a much deeper rooted, much more integrated fashion. Why a lack of progress? Because it hasn't been a priority. There hasn't been a fiscal economic priority. I could stop there, but there has been progress. There is enormous amount of knowledge just in the research sector enormous amounts of infrastructure, new technology, new capacities to take the pulse of nature that we did not have even 10 years ago. So the question is, how do we use those technologies respectfully? How do we generate the information and use that in a way that's respecting, folding in nature into the economic decisions that we make? This is speaking to Francois, that there is a bottom line. That bottom line includes nature. So I think there is a transition to doing that. The notions of nature's contributions to people, ecosystem services, all of these are interlinked. So I also think there is a coalescence of, priority that we're seeing. It'll come out of COP15. It's coming a little bit out of COP26. Is that we can no longer keep going on a business as usual trajectory, and that the progress that we are seeing now has to happen. It's let's call it a state of emergency, if we like. And so my expectation is that let's call it a latency in civil society that is going to very quickly change in the coming years.
Super. Thanks very much, Andy. We have a question from the audience about old growth forests, which I love because it's very difficult to think about what's happening with old growth forests, which we have almost none left whatsoever, without having a very visceral and emotional response. And yet they continue to be cut down, much to the absolute amazement of anyone I talk to. So what would it take? Maybe I'll ask this to Kyle first, but then everyone else can weigh in too. What would it take to make the cutting of old growth forests illegal in Canada and for it to stop just right now?
Sorry, am I unmuted or muted?
You're unmuted. I can hear you.
Unmuted. That's a tough one. So I think one of the things we have to be careful with is this idea that if logging old growth forests means banning ever cutting a tree again, that is sort of putting forward this idea that people cannot be part of and use nature at all. And so where I'm coming from is thinking of the West Coast context in terms of cedars, for example, which is often cedar forests are where the most controversy is, because these are the 1,000-year-old trees that are falling down. But cedar has been on the West Coast for 4,000 to 7,000 years. Someone here probably knows better than I do exactly how long. People have been here for a lot longer than that, right? A lot longer than that. And people have been using those cedar trees since day one, because the trees came after the people. And those big trees are actually really culturally important. Those big trees, monumental cedars is the term for them, are used for building, for poles, for canoe. They're quite culturally important. And so the idea that those could never be taken again when they've been taken for thousands of years, I think is problematic. I don't think that's what the person is referring to, though. I think that's more talking about industrial, clear-cut forestry, which often, almost entirely, has happened without the free, prior, and informed consent of the nations on whose land those trees are being taken from. And I think, so how does that stop? I mean, this has been a lot of what Dr. Littlechild has talked about. It's been basically, if Canada, British Columbia as well, British Columbia has a provincial version of UN DRIP. But if these principles that Canada has claimed to be following, and the principles of free, prior, and informed consent were actually followed, then if there's not consent on lands of the nations from whose territory these trees are being taken, then that cutting should not happen. It is already illegal, is another way to put it, if it doesn't have the consent of the peoples from whom it's taken. So I think one way to address this, the issue at least of where the logging happens in territories from which there is not consent, and it's goes against the nation's wishes, I think would be to just breathe life into things like UN DRIP internationally, DRIPA, the BC version, etc., which have all Canada and BC have claimed that they follow anyways. I think it's a lot more complicated if we get into issues where nations do want to log them, because it's if you're talking about sovereignty, if you're talking about rights, it's ultimately the nations. It's their rights. It's to make governance decisions on their lands, and I think that's where it's really important to really understand what what the background of the logging is there and what it's supporting. I think that in those cases it's more complicated, but I think just to circle back, I think where most of this sort of industrial, clear-cut, extractive, damaging logging has not happened with consent, and is not sort of a reflection of laws that would have governed these forests for millennia. So just again, free, prior, and informed consent, I think, would address a huge bulk of that.
Thanks, Kyle. Would anyone else like to weigh in on that? If you do, you could put up your finger and I'll call it. Okay, Danica.
I just wanted to support that basic premise that Kyle just articulated around free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples and their territories. And I know that this question is obviously related to the events at Fairy Creek and at Wet'suwet'en, where we are seeing sort of, and have seen for many decades now, ongoing criminalization of Indigenous peoples who are trying to protect the integrity of ecosystems that are sacred to them, that are related to their identities and their livelihoods and their lifeways, and their existence. And it's an unfortunate fact that during the pandemic, we've seen more assassinations of Indigenous rights defenders than we ever have in the history of the world. And a lot of those have happened, in impacted communities of Indigenous peoples. And unfortunately here in Canada, it's also a fact that the law is almost always used as sort of is almost always weaponized against Indigenous advocacy, in trying to protect what is left. And it's unfortunate that when First Nations contest the authority of a province or a regulatory process like an environmental management decision or a clear-cut decision that fails to acknowledge their lack of consent, companies take advantage of a legal system built to protect the interests of property. So the Yellowhead Institute here in Canada did a review of almost 100 cases of injunctions and found that this legal tool reinforces the impossibility of choices First Nations must make when they appear before Canadian courts. The sad tally was that 76% of the injunctions filed against First Nations by corporations were granted, while 81% of injunctions filed against corporations by First Nations were denied. And perhaps most tellingly, 82% of injunctions filed by First Nations against the government were denied. And as I mentioned earlier today in the panel, we are now seeing the first days of the Business and Human Rights Forum, which is based on the elucidation of the guiding principles on business and human rights, which talk about the government duty to protect and the corporate duty to respect and the right to a remedy. So if we think about this in the context of, what we're seeing in Wet'suwet'en or in Fairy Creek, where we've seen more arrests for civil disobedience than ever before in Canada, we are seeing that we are facing a very important moment in our collective history, that we are facing, the prospect of having to make some very real choices about what the standards and the metrics are that we should employ when we think about biodiversity conservation and who should be a part of that conversation. And I think Francois has so much to offer us in this regard. And it really was wonderful to hear him talk about the initial name of his project, which I thought was so appropriate. So thank you, Francois, for all your wonderful work.
Thank you, Danica. This is wonderful. So when we started out and everyone was talking about very different things, it was hard to see how these things might fit together because they're all important at different scales for different forms of governance. But I actually am, through all of your points, starting to see how it could fit together. I wish we could tease it out a little bit longer to get in even deeper into these questions. We're actually going to have to wrap it up in a minute or two. I was just wondering if Francois or Andy had any closing thoughts in sort of a minute that you might want to add.
From my perspective, very quickly, Andy, I'm not in a position to add more to what was said by Kyle and Danica. But perhaps to say that I feel it as my responsibility, because I don't do policy, I don't comment on policy, but what I can do is provide information. And what we strive to do is to make the invisible visible. And there's a lot that comes from our world that is not monetized, that is part of the system, but unrecognizedly so. We don't. So part of my duty is to make it such that as many things or as many services are actually become part of public awareness.
I would just add some thoughts on the overall perspective of this session, which is charting biodiversity pathways for sustainability in Canada. And so far, we've talked about Canada within our coastline. And I think from a biodiversity point of view, it's very important to recognize our more remote responsibility elsewhere in the world, the way we have imported biodiversity loss, the way our industries act elsewhere. There is increasing transparency in the sense that Francois is talking about it there on how that's happening. This remote responsibility is a collective responsibility. It comes down to decisions we make as individuals just as much as it is about decisions we make as civil society and the industries that we promote and support. And I think it's very, very important we recognize our role internationally, not just because we're the second largest country in the world with the longest coastline in the world, but because of the way our 36 or 37 million Canadians act beyond our borders, so to speak. I'd like to see Canada be strong at COP15, at the new global biodiversity framework. I would like to see the good words that we talk about, put some action behind that, and some strong policies that allow us, those of us willing to act collectively, to implement that on the ground. So that I'll leave with that.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. I'm going to hand it over to Sylvia to give a formal thanks, but I just want to say that it's a real pleasure to listen to all your thoughts today. It's very energizing. So thank you very much. And I'll hand the mic over to Sylvia.
Well, thank you all so much. I just want to start by profoundly thanking our panelists today for taking the time to share the richness of their experience and their reflections about this critical topic. I know that all of you, your day is seeped in this every day, thinking about how we can move forward together better. What I really took away from listening to each of your discussions also, not only was the richness of your experience, which left me with a lot to reflect on, but also it left me hopeful. The capacity for each of you to identify in your own sphere of influence and in reflection, sort of meaningful and concrete actions that we can be taking today, that are also collaborative in their nature, and how we can start to think about building bridges to work together, leaves me with a very positive feeling about how we might think about constructing a pathway to a more biodiverse future. I think the other thing that really struck me as I listened to many of the issues, especially some of the ones that Kyle was bringing up about scale, was that when we think about the biodiversity and the ecosystems that we're all here and talking about and wanting to engage and protect, is that they are all fundamentally at their core built from a collective of individuals who are unique in their genetic structure, but also with their interactions with each other, that come together to form this sort of emergent property that is biodiversity. And much of it, as Kyle said, is very place-based. These species, these people that compose ecosystems too, are located in one place, and their interactions are meaningful in that place. But the more and more that we study these things across larger scales, we're starting to see that those interactions at small scales can have telecoupled interactions across many different ecosystems and many different geographies. And so understanding how those are linked is also quite important. And that complexity, we can't approach it with a very simplistic approach to how we want to manage it. We have to manage it with an equally diverse and multi-scalar type approach. So making sure that there are place-based solutions and approaches in place that are also linking up to cross-scale, higher-level federal initiatives that are also bringing in the richness of all the different peoples who are engaged in working towards this end. I think it's going to be really important. And so I feel like there's this beautiful parallel between how the ecosystems themselves are constructed and that we are actually part of, and then the systems that we might need to put in place in order to effectively engage with them and manage them as we move forward. And I think, what Andy, or I'm sorry, maybe it was Danica had mentioned, how coming out of COP26, the message is that we can't keep doing business as usual. And I think the same message applies when we think about biodiversity conservation. We can't keep using the same systems that we've used in the past because we know that they're not yielding the results that we want to see in the future. And so I think identifying these spaces for co-creation are really important. And so with that, I just want to say thank you to everybody, and I hope that we can continue to do that together. And there's a link to a report which identifies some of the ways in which we think that these types of actions can be implemented in a meaningful and constructive way for Canada moving forward to create a more biodiverse future. So please check it out. I think it has a lot of exciting initiatives proposed.